hopes for the 1619 Project. Nicole, the response to your book, your hope for America. I know you've got a movie deal coming up, a series. It sounds exciting. What are you hoping for the response for your book and for America?
So we're in production right now on the 1619 documentary series. It's a 6-part series that, if you listen to the podcast, similar, every episode is an essay from the book. And it's supposed to come out sometime early next year on Hulu and then air on ABC, the network. But my largest hope for the project is reparations. The final essay in the book is called Justice, and what I argue in the book is if you read the book from start to finish with an open mind, there's only one conclusion that you can come to, which is that this country owes the descendants of American slavery a great debt. It is a moral debt, but it's also a financial debt. We're taught to think of slavery as a racist institution, and we like to think about that way because it's somewhat comforting, because then we can say, well, we passed all those civil rights laws in the 1960s, so you all have equality, we have ended racism in the law, that is all this country is required to do. But slavery was an economic system. You don't transport 13 million human beings across the Atlantic just because you don't like black people. You transport 13 million people across the Atlantic because you want exploitable labor. And that is what they did. And then they create racism to justify the exploitation, right? How do you treat people like they're property? You have to say they're not human like you. But this was an economic system. It was an economic system designed to extract wealth from black bodies and redistribute that wealth to white institutions and to white Americans, as was what we benignly call Jim Crow. The 100 years that followed the end of slavery, it was 100 years of violently enforced racial apartheid. We don't like to use that term here, but if you look up the definition of apartheid, that's what it was. And that was designed to keep an exploitable class of labor as close to slavery as possible, to not allow black people to get an education that would allow them to compete economically with white people, to force black people to stay on the plantation or in menial labor jobs, to maintain the economic hierarchy. So we should then be unsurprised that since none of the civil rights laws dealt with the 350-year economic head start that white Americans have, that black Americans still have the lowest wealth of all racial groups. And in fact, the wealth gap between black and white Americans has remained unchanged since the time the king was assassinated. So we get all of these legal rights, but as Dr. King said, what's the good of being able to go to the restaurant if you can't afford the hamburger? And that's where black people are financially. So this is always like the gut check moment for me, right? People who come see me are a self-selecting audience. Probably have a Black Lives Matter sign in your yard, support, right? Say that you support equality, but then when I say reparations, the pearls get clutched all of a sudden. People feel some type of way about it. And I think we really, really, really need to ask ourselves why. The majority of white Democrats, so these are the people who ostensibly are our allies, are opposed to reparations. Even though we know black people have never had a fair chance economically in this society. We know that wealth is accumulated over time, that we can have a great deal of control over our income, but very little control over wealth that we were not allowed to create through federal, local, state, and private policy. So why would we not want to alleviate the forced wealth, poverty, and suffering of 13% of our population when we can do it? One thing the pandemic taught us, we can print money overnight if we want to. $3 trillion, I don't know where it came from, but they found it, right? And the last thing, I see you over here uncomfortable, so I want to hear what you have to say. The last thing I'll say quickly on that, we can pass a reparations program and alleviate the lack of wealth that black Americans have. Most black people will never be killed by the police, but nearly all of us have a lack of wealth that doesn't allow us, if we have a single financial issue, right? If we have a medical bill, if we lose our job, we go from middle class to poverty instantly. And it's not because we're not working, because income stops as soon as your job stops. Wealth is something that stacks and accumulates over time. That is the buffer. That's what allows you to send your children to school without debt. It's what allows you to buy a home. Black people have been denied access to all of that. So we can have a reparations program and still pass every anti-poverty program that we need to. I believe in helping poor people no matter what their race is. So we can have universal health care. We can have a universal basic income. We can have universal child care. We can do all of those things, but that is distinct from reparations and the specific harm that black people face no matter what their income is. So that is my biggest hope, is that we can take reparations from being treated as a fringe political issue to being the very linchpin of any type of justice or reconciliation around slavery.
There was I got curious when I read that chapter, and I looked up examples of American reparations.
Yes.
And President Reagan signed a reparation bill and an apology for the Japanese who were illegally interned
Yes.
in World War II. My Indian tribe, their homeland was stolen. They got reparations in the form of land.
Yes.
1906, my cousin still has 140 acres. So there are some sensible examples.
Yes. We believe in reparations for everybody but black people. I mean, so the beauty of having studied something for as long as I have is I wrote that essay against every single argument I've seen about reparations. I literally structured around everything that I've heard. Well, what about this? Well, what about that? So then I get data and I refute every argument. And namely the one that nobody's alive today who was enslaved. Well, guess what? People who were enslaved tried to get reparations. And they had to go to the same white supremacist government that had allowed them to be in slavery in the first place and then say, you should pay us for the slavery that you forced upon us. And we're somehow surprised that that government didn't listen, right? And we have people in this room right now who are victims of racial apartheid. I mean, I'm 46 years old, and 10 years before I was born, it was legal to discriminate against descendants of slavery in every aspect of American life. Housing, school, employment, public facilities. A decade before I was born. I'm not that old. I mean, you know, I'm using face creams, but I'm not that old. So we have to understand that the same way that wealth is accumulated over time, so is debt. And failure to pay the debt does not alleviate that the debt is still owed. And the reason that black people are in the condition that they're in is not because they're black. Black is a fiction. Black was made up, right? Black is a category that was made up. That's why you can see someone as light-skinned as I am and still be called black, because it is a category that was made up to order our social and economic relations. We are in the condition we are in because we descend from American slavery. And so all of these policies that were enacted were to control and to maintain as close to possible quasi-slavery for the descendants of slavery. And so that is why reparations is owed to the descendants of slavery, because our conditions are because we are descendants of slavery.